land. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the continuing custodians of this country, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. As we gather here on the shores of beautiful Sydney Harbour to eat, to share stories, to share new ideas and hopes for our country's future, it's important to reflect that this place has long been a meeting place, to recognise the knowledge and wisdom that's been passed down right here for generations. As we move into today's discussion, looking ahead to Australia's energy transition, a fundamental challenge for our collective future, I urge you all to consider how your actions, how this transition will contribute to a better future for our First Nations communities. A few months ago in Canberra, on Ngunnawal country, CEDA had the privilege to host the Honourable Linda Burney and Senator Pat Dodson. Some of you may have been with us on that night. They shared their reflections on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and issued an open invitation to all of us to walk the journey toward voice, treaty, truth. Starting with voice, Minister Burney rightly noted it's everyone's responsibility to get this done. Voice is a nation-building project, much like our energy transition. It cannot solely be led by government. Everyone has a part to play, particularly the business community. And I echo Minister Burney's call. If you have not yet read the Uluru Statement from the Heart, pick up your phone, your tablet, your laptop, do so, then talk about it at home, at work, in your communities. A simple first step in our journey toward reconciliation. For over 60 years, CEDA has convened conversations on the issues that matter. Today's event forms part of a suite of activity across the country seeking to bring together leading voices from business, government and civil society on how we as a nation can equitably build climate resilience, push ahead in our energy transition and regain our energy advantage. We can't do this important work without the support of our members. I'd like to acknowledge today's major sponsor, PwC, represented by Fiona McIntyre, partner in energy transition. Thank you for your support. And of course, Frank Calabria and the team at Origin Energy. Thank you for all the work that's gone into today. We know it's a very busy time for you all. We'll shortly be served lunch, after which I will jump back up here to formally introduce Frank and invite him to make his address. Following that, Frank will sit down with Fiona for some Q&A. Very quickly, some light housekeeping. Today, like all CEDA events, is interactive. Please join the conversation on social media. You can find us at CEDA_news and using the hashtag energy transition. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions using our Q&A app, Pigeonhole. Please scan the QR code on your table to access both the app and today's program. If you read the headlines, it'll come as no surprise that we do have media in the room today. Media colleagues, just a quick reminder that Frank will be doing a quick doorstop following his address and Q&A, so please, if you can hold your questions till then. For now, please enjoy your lunch. Hello again. So at CEDA, we're very fortunate to work closely with our member organisations like Origin Energy and to hear directly from leaders on critical issues of the day. There are few issues bigger or more fundamental than getting our energy transition right. At the forefront of this is Origin Energy, with a significant footprint across the energy sector and 4.5 million customer accounts. It has one of the nation's largest power generation portfolios and is a leading gas supplier on the East Coast. I'm so very pleased to invite Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director Frank Calabria, who has been at the helm of Origin since October 2016, to share his views on Australia's progress towards a cleaner, smarter energy future and to update us on Origin's Climate Transition Action Plan. Frank last spoke with us in 2019 on his vision toward 2050, and I look forward to hearing how the last few years have continued to shape this. Just a reminder, following Frank's address, he'll be joined on stage by PwC's Fiona McIntyre. So please get your questions ready, scan that QR code and pop them in the app, and join me in welcoming Frank to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Jet. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, which, as you should all know, is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge Jet's wonderful summary of the journey that CEDA and her views on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'm happy to say, and very proud to say, that Origin is a very public advocate for the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I would urge everyone to get behind it. All right. I'd also like to officially welcome you all here today and acknowledge the sponsor, PwC. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, speaking on a topic I'm incredibly passionate about, the energy transition. The simplicity of those words, those few words, the energy transition, defy the sheer scale and complexity of the challenge and opportunity that lies in front of us. We are talking about a multi-decade, large-scale global transformation that will fundamentally change every aspect of our energy system. And by that I mean the way we source, produce, supply, distribute and use energy. Society's shared goal, all of our shared goal, to reduce emissions from energy is clear. And we have good alignment across state and federal governments, businesses and the community to work towards net zero emissions by 2050, or even sooner. Origin's own aim is to be net zero across scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions across our full value chain by 2050. And our inaugural Climate Transition Action Plan, which we released in August, also outlined more ambitious short-term and medium-term goals. By 2030, we're targeting a 40% reduction in our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions intensity on an equity basis, and we are also targeting a 20 million tonne reduction in absolute scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, all based from a 2019 baseline. Over the past 5 years, Origin's total scope 1 and 2 equity emissions have declined 21%, and I thought it was important to remind people of progress and to emphasise this in the wake of COP27, even as we acknowledge there remains a very large task ahead to decarbonise energy supply. The energy transition is already well underway, with renewables today accounting for around 30% of the total volume of electricity supplied in the national electricity market, or in the acronym world of energy known as the NEM. And more than 3 million homes have rooftop solar. 3 million homes have rooftop solar in Australia, which means that more than 1 in 3 Australian households are harnessing the benefits of the sun. We are fortunate in Australia to be in a strong position relative to global peers in developing a reliable, affordable cleaner energy system. We have all of the ingredients to be successful: an abundant renewable resources, access to capital, stable governments, and broad-based community support. And of course, 2050 is a long time horizon, and there are a myriad different scenarios that may play out over that period. So for the purpose of today's discussion, my focus is on the next phase of the transition, which is the time frame from now till 2030. No matter which way you look at it, the scale of the change over this decade will be truly staggering. And so bear with me here as I outline what would be required to achieve the current government's goals. By 2030, we expect $76 billion to be invested in energy infrastructure in Australia, as estimated by Labor's Powering Australia plan. That's 3% of GDP, and with inflationary pressures, I think many in the room would believe this to be a conservative estimate. 44 gigawatts of renewables will be needed to be built to achieve the government's 82% renewables target. 28 gigawatts of that will come from utility scale assets, and 16 gigawatts behind the meter. 28 gigawatts of utility scale renewables would be 110 250 megawatt projects to be delivered between now and the end of the decade. Some 15 gigawatts of firming needs will need to be installed to back up renewables, the bulk of which will be short duration storage. 10,000 kilometres of new transmission needs to be built. And over that time, almost 8 gigawatts of coal-fired power is expected to have left the system. And through that time, we expect electricity demand in the NEM to have grown by at least 15% as sectors like transport electrify. And on the aggressive scenarios, which I'm sure someone in this room has actually done, up to 5 million EVs could be on our roads under the most bullish of those scenarios. All of this will be incurring concurrently, representing a magnitude of investment and construction akin to the wartime reconstruction effort. The upshot is that in a decade, our energy system will be virtually unrecognisable when compared against today. And as if this wasn't enough of a challenge, the task became more complex over the past year or so. It was clear as the global economy and demand rebounded from COVID shutdowns that the energy supply balance had become increasingly tight, and when combined with the low investment in new supply, this caused prices to rise. And we shouldn't forget that prices were rising. They were rising well before what then occurred, which was the war in Ukraine. And we moved rapidly to what the International Energy Agency has called the world's first truly global energy crisis. The war has placed pressure on global energy supply and sent commodity prices soaring. Countries around the world are grappling with the same significant challenges in accessing secure, reliable energy, and homes and businesses are paying much higher prices heading into the Northern Hemisphere winter. While the impacts here are not nearly as acute as the UK and Europe, we are certainly not immune, and Australian homes and businesses are already feeling the impact of rising energy prices, with more to come. Related to these global events, but not solely caused by them, we had an extraordinary period in June here in the national electricity market, where it was pushed to its absolute limits and ultimately resulting in the entire market being suspended for the first time in its history. Significant coal plant outages, coal supply challenges due to weather and other factors, hydro supply challenges, and an early winter spike in demand due to cold weather and lower renewables output had all combined to send wholesale prices soaring. And I'm sure none of this is really new news to you in this room, as these challenges have played out on the front pages of newspapers for months. And given the essential nature of the products and services we provide, governments are evaluating all the levers available to them to place downward pressure on prices and support vulnerable members of the community, all the while keeping an eye on the longer-term goal of delivering the energy transition. I've often talked about what customers stand to gain from a future energy system more aligned to a 1.5 degree future. But right now, those benefits feel out of reach and out of step with what many customers are experiencing today. With 4.5 million customer accounts, we hear every day how customers large and small are managing their energy costs and many are concerned about the rising cost of living, not just energy prices, but mortgages and rent, fuel, groceries, and a range of other household staples. A future built on renewable energy with new energy such as electric vehicles is something to look forward to, but delivering the energy transition, given the scale of investment required, will undoubtedly create upwards pressure on energy bills. I fear energy prices could erode community support for the transition, a task that can only be delivered with the coordination and commitment across governments, the private sector, market operators, regulators and communities. All of these stakeholder groups must increase efforts to inform the community about the challenges, not just the opportunities, and the costs of the transition. We must be honest about the likely impact on bills over the short to medium term to reduce bill shock. Energy retailers are the highest profile players in the supply chain as issuers of the energy bills, yet as we know, the composition of charges belong to many across the chain, from governments and regulators to transmission and distribution providers. We must consider what levers are available to ease in cost inputs right across energy bills, while implementing additional support for those in the community that are least able to pay. Which brings me to what I believe are the 6 immediate challenges we must address to enable us to get where we need to by 2030 in order to unlock the benefits of the transition. The first of those is we must heed the lessons from the June crisis in the NEM. Ultimately, we were able to navigate extraordinarily challenging time and keep the lights on for our customers, and there are some important lessons to take. We must retain and maintain reliability of our existing power system while we build out our new low emissions system. Over the next few years, we will not be able to meet the needs of customers reliably and affordably without existing generation performing well. Coal still fuels around 65% of the electricity supply in the NEM and is only reduced from 75% 4 years ago. And so Origin was also not immune from those coal supply challenges in June, threatening our ability to run a Eraring power station. Our teams worked incredibly hard, some of who are in the room today, to diversify our coal supply and increase rail deliveries to ensure it could provide and continue to provide reliable power. But it is worth noting that we could only achieve that through the collaboration and the work we did together with coal suppliers, rail network operators and governments. This crisis in June in the NEM also drove home the important role gas plays and will continue to play for some time in our energy system, and in particular providing reliable power through gas-fired power stations and in firming the intermittent renewable energy supply. Gas peakers stepped in to fill the void when those coal plant outages occurred in June, and I have no doubt that without them the lights would have gone out. As we look ahead to more renewables entering the system and the likelihood of further reliability challenges for ageing coal fleet in the system, firming technologies including storage, pumped hydro and gas peakers will play a critical role as they step in quickly when the market needs more supply. We continue to support the establishment of a capacity mechanism which is now needed as a matter of urgency to drive new investment in backup or firming generation. It is an important policy to underpin reliability of the system by rewarding the availability of new dispatchable capacity. Secondly, we must execute projects with greater urgency. A great deal has happened in 2022, with 8 gigawatts of accelerated coal closures announced, including Eraring, and now when you add in the state policy announcements from Queensland and Victoria, that's a further 9 gigawatts of closures by 2035. Against this backdrop, I'd argue that we're still not moving with enough urgency to build the replacement infrastructure needed within the next 7 years to manage coal closures and achieve the nation's objective of 82% renewables by 2030. So as each day passes, not only does the urgency and complexity of the challenge increase, so too does the cost. We need to deliver utility-scale renewables faster than we've ever done before. The NEM currently has 3 gigawatts of renewable capacity slated to come online. This is good, but we need 28 gigawatts by 2030. Origin sees a multi-gigawatt opportunity to grow renewables and storage in our portfolio over the coming years, and we're progressing plans on the 700 megawatt battery on the Eraring site, have acquired around 1.6 gigawatts of solar development projects. And in our Climate Transition Action Plan, we set out a target to grow renewables and storage capacity within our generation portfolio by 4 gigawatts to 4 gigawatts by 2030. Firming 2 needs to be built at pace. Of the 15 gigawatts of firming needed by 2030, only 4 gigawatts is slated to come online, and 2 gigawatts of that is facing delay. In transmission, major projects covering the 10,000 kilometres need to be built as quickly as possible, because without that, the ability to connect new renewable energy supply and storage to the grid is compromised. In Origin's experience, there is no shortage of global capital keen to invest in Australia's energy transition. This is a fortunate position to be in, and evidenced, I think, recently by the indicative, conditional and non-binding bid by Brookfield and EIG to acquire Origin, and also Brookfield's ambition to invest $20 billion in delivering the transition to Australia out to 2030. This is just one example, but there are many global energy companies and funds with deep pockets keen to play a bigger role in our transition. But intent is only one thing, but what can we do practically to make this speed up, or get it done to speed up execution? I'm sure there's plenty of people in this room will know that streamlining approvals, better coordination of community consultation, particularly around the renewable energy zones, where there are likely to be multiple infrastructure projects across renewables, batteries and transmission in quick succession, is one way we can accelerate. It is clearly better for the community to hear a single, coordinated narrative around the transition and impacts on their community, and it's more time and cost efficient for multiple projects. With access to labour another major challenge, we will inevitably need to tap the global market for highly skilled workers, and governments could support this effort. At Origin, we're also looking at longer-term partnership agreements with contractors, so rather than contracting on a per-project basis, we partner to deliver a suite of renewables or battery developments over several years, enabling efficiencies in planning, resourcing, supply chain and logistics. The real key is we need industry, regulators and governments actively working towards common goals and common timeframes. Thirdly, we must actively manage project delivery risks, because despite our best efforts to unlock processes and accelerate execution, which was the second immediate challenge, given the scale of this infrastructure challenge, history tells us that projects in Australia take longer and can cost more than planned. Most recently, we all know that Snowy 2.0 has been delayed and its overall project costs increase, and we have the Energy Connect transmission project between South Australia and New South Wales that's also delayed by a year. For that reason, we also, in addition to accelerating execution, need to give careful consideration to what policies that can help them manage the final timeline for coal closures. The reality is that the policy support to date in Australia has been consistently provided to introduce new renewables into the system and low emissions energy supply, and it is now time to refocus effort and support for an orderly transition away from coal. Coal closure timeframes have accelerated this year, and we now have 17 gigawatts now announced to expected to leave the market by 2035, which will dwarf what has happened to date in the energy system and the challenges we've experienced. And that's important, because that's important to achieve our nation's emissions targets. However, consideration must be given to the cumulative impact of these closures on the market, alongside the prospect of delays to new infrastructure coming online. There may be a requirement to delay the exit of some of these coal units, and only for as long as needed, to maintain the security and reliability of the national electricity market. These policies will need to be flexible, with consideration given to commercial factors like compensation for costs incurred in running uneconomic plants, as well as the need to retain coal plant workers, secure coal supply contracts, and many other related matters. Fourth, we must not ignore the demand side. When it comes to the transition, we need to use every tool to reduce emissions, maintain reliability and manage costs. And the supply side is only one part of the equation. Harnessing the flexibility of demand side management has an important role to play, and this is currently an untapped opportunity in the market. Many large energy users are already familiar with the value they can realise from demand management, and some participate in lucrative programs reducing their demand to help manage peak events in the electricity market. But more can be done on a day-to-day basis to balance supply and demand efficiently while unlocking savings for customers and encouraging more renewables into the system. This also has the potential to help us avoid investment in unnecessarily centralised infrastructure where we can. At Origin, we run one of the largest virtual power plants in the market with around 300 megawatts under management and growing very fast. We have some 120 to 130,000 devices already connected and being controlled and managed in real time using artificial intelligence. This is already bigger than a unit at a gas-fired peaking power plant, and as the virtual power plant scales, it has the potential to alleviate pressure on the grid during peak times. The virtual power plant allows for the more effective management of demand in real time by shifting energy use into periods where renewable output is abundant and energy costs cheaper. Origin's also led the way in demand management for the mass market through our Spike program, which connects to our virtual power plant, which is a way in which consumers can use, in an easy way, a gamified platform for reducing their energy during what we call spike hours. We've had great success with this program to date, and it can play a role in allowing smarter, more efficient use of all energy capacity that sits across the distributed assets in people's homes. Fifthly, achieving emissions targets will come at a cost, and this cost must be shared, and it must come with the support for the vulnerable. In the recent federal budget, the government advised that electricity prices were projected to increase by a further 30% next financial year, which in addition to the 20% increase this year is where the magic number of 56% came from. These are prices that are set by the regulators in both by the AER and also by the Victorian regulator, the ESC. They're driven by higher wholesale energy costs. That's why they can see them. They've already been incurred and continue to be incurred from June this year that are yet to be recovered. This will be very difficult for many customers, particularly given other cost of living pressures. And to give you an example, the interest rate increases since May will drive the payments on a $750,000 mortgage up by more than $1,100 per month, to name one of those other drivers in people's cost of living. And the investment needed in the energy infrastructure will place further upwards pressure on bills between now and 2030, notwithstanding the benefits it will deliver. That $76 billion in investment to deliver the transition that I mentioned earlier needs to be paid for. It's our core belief at Origin that the decarbonisation of energy will be good for customers. It will drive an influx of cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy and storage, and over time this will place downward pressure on wholesale energy prices. It will also be a more democratised energy system, providing far greater opportunity for people to actively engage with their energy choices and manage their costs. However, we must recognise there will be limits to the magnitude of price increases that the community can and will absorb on the premise that it will result in cheaper and cleaner energy over time. To avoid losing community support, we need greater coordination and we need greater collaboration between retailers, transmission and distribution companies, regulators and advocacy groups, and both state and federal governments. We must find equitable methods to share the costs of the transition between all parts of the energy chain, the value chain, including governments, and maintaining a healthy and competitive market. And we must not forget that recent high wholesale energy prices resulted in 7 smaller energy retailers failing. We need to put in place stronger support frameworks for vulnerable members of our community, and I recognise the significant work the AER and the industry are already doing here and continue to do to provide for those that are less able to pay. And lastly, and most importantly, we need to have an honest conversation with the community about the ambition and targets we're aiming to achieve, and with that, the associated cost of that scale and pace of change. Last, or the sixth, we need to acknowledge and support the continuing role of gas. It's indisputable that gas will continue to play a critical role in the energy system for some time. Gas peaking plants I referred to earlier will continue to underpin reliable energy supply in combination with the other firming technologies like storage and pumped hydro, given their ability to supply the market over very long durations when needed, both days and weeks, versus the hours of supply from both battery or pumped hydro. Gas remains a major source of energy for heating homes in colder parts of Australia, and it will inevitably take time for these households to switch out of gas. Gas is also critical for large businesses, and while those sectors that can electrify will, in many cases a viable alternative to gas isn't yet available. Today our gas market is facing significant challenges. Globally, gas supply remains tight, and it will take time for new supply to come online to address this imbalance. Commodity prices remain high, and domestic prices have risen compared to last year, although to a much lesser extent than we are seeing in overseas markets. And while spot prices in Australia remain well below international export prices, we're acutely aware of the pressure higher gas prices place on large gas users. Origin's also exposed to these challenges as a last buyer of gas to support the needs of our customers. To solve gas challenges on the east coast of Australia, it remains important to diversify supply beyond the existing sources. Given the lag in new energy supply coming online, we need to take steps now to encourage new sources of supply near southern markets where the traditional fields are in decline and most gas demand exists. They are the 6 immediate challenges. We have positioned Origin for this energy transition, and we are very excited about it and the benefits that it will ultimately deliver for customers and the planet. We have moved towards a community support broadly about targets we want to achieve by 2030. However, I don't believe it's helpful to underestimate the challenges ahead, and it's only by facing into them that we can find the solutions. It is a truly staggering task to achieve these 2030 targets, and we must act with more urgency as each month that passes makes that challenge harder and the propensity for adding costs. We must never forget who we serve and our central objective of delivering reliable, affordable and cleaner energy for customers. We must acknowledge the cost burden of the investment required, and we must shield the most vulnerable who can least afford to pay. This must be done while maintaining an honest dialogue with the community that amounts to much more than virtue signalling about emissions reduction. The community won't congratulate us for that if we deliver poor reliability outcomes or unsustainable price increases on the way through. I fundamentally believe this is one of our biggest risks, and we simply cannot afford to lose community support, or we risk derailing the transition. The transition is the very thing that will put us on a pathway to cleaner, smarter and lower cost energy system that we know will benefit us all over time. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Frank.
No problem.
So,
No Origin people are asking questions out there on their apps, are they? Or I'll know it's you. Okay.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fiona McIntyre, and I'm a partner in PwC's energy transition business. PwC recently established this business to bring people across our firm together to really help accelerate our clients with the energy transition, creating meaningful and sustained value and driving environmental, social and economic benefits. With this in mind, it's my pleasure to host this conversation with Frank today and facilitate Q&A. If you've got any questions for Frank, you can ask questions via the Pigeonhole app. The link and passcode should be on your screen. You can also vote for questions that you like as you review those. Alternatively, more the old school way, you can also put up your hand, a microphone will come, and if that happens, I'd ask you to please introduce yourself and the organisation you work for, and also to keep your question reasonably brief to allow time for others. So I'd like to start with a few questions of my own. And you spoke about this before, Frank, in terms of just the energy transformation required to reach net zero is such an enormous task, both in terms of the scale and the pace of change required. And we've spoken about the long-run decarbonisation is obviously a huge benefit for the planet, the customers and the community. But in the short term, the path will be bumpy. And that's even before you think about the macro factors of inflation and interest rates. And I guess, how well do you think the consumers and businesses actually understand the cost and the impact of this energy transition, and how do you ensure their continued support?
I think the reason for my speech today is that I don't think it's well understood at all. I think the community understands and feels connected to the long-term decarbonisation and the benefits of the planet. But when they think about energy, they think in that horizon that is good, and why wouldn't you feel good? But they think about their bill today and they don't connect the two. And so I think that's why I think we need to draw the connection between the two. Because I think when bills arise with little forewarning, people they feel disempowered by that, they don't understand what's caused that. And as a result, I think we need to draw that connection. I don't think it's well understood. And by the way, we should try to achieve all of that for our customers, and that's one of the reasons for my comments today. And you'll recall I was on a panel the other day, and Jeff Dimmery from Alinta was the first person that said it was 35% increase. And you saw what happened. If that was well known by the community of what's currently experiencing, then we wouldn't have seen the reaction to it. And you've seen since then the Treasurer's comments, which I think were done well intended to say we've got further increases coming in the short term. So I think that's one of the things that we've got to take on the challenge, and that starts with me and other participants across the sector.
And probably a neat segue into my next question. So electricity and gas prices have risen considerably this year, expected to rise further. There's been speculation in the press about the need for the government to intervene. Do you think the government needs to intervene? And if so, what do you suggest the government should do to try and temper the price increases for consumers and businesses?
I'll always start this, but that's a role for governments. But nevertheless, I think when it comes to that, you've seen the reaction, and now governments, when they see a rising price for an essential service like we provide, and the industry provides, then clearly they'll be looking at all levers available, or they'll be looking at avenues to actually provide that relief to customers. And I understand that, actually. So I think that it's not an easy, and you can see that in the dialogue over recent weeks, to find a way to do that. And I think they're trying to balance all the needs of the stakeholders along the way. But it's really up to governments to decide when they feel they need to intervene or not, but you can see the pressure on them right now.
And do you think it needs to be a short-term intervention or a longer-term potential change to regulation and policy?
When I think a bit about, I always start from the view that intervention ultimately can arise with both unintended consequences but overall cost over time. And we've seen interventions over time, and I firmly believe they've had consequences over time. So I'm a believer in the fact that if you give certainty or you give strong signals for investment and supply and all of those things, that they'll be much better solutions over the long run. So therefore I would always start with the premise that if you think you need to do something, then you should be doing that in the least disruptive way and for the shortest period of time if you think you need to do that. And I don't think we should forget that from our perspective, the industry's worn quite a lot of pain along the way, and I know we play a role, an important role, but we have seen a lot of pressure on the sector, and so I think we are also one of those stakeholders that need to be thought about in that context. But it all does start with us all, as I said today, coming together and working with all of the participants across the sector that work for outcomes for customers. So we'll play our role in that as well.
And the role of gas, you spoke about that before as well, and you spoke about it, your recent climate transition plan talked about the key role gas peakers particularly have to play in terms of ensuring reliability of energy supply. I guess, how do you see the role of gas changing over time for both consumers and industry, and what role does hydrogen have to play both domestically and from an export perspective?
Look, I think gas is going to play an important role for some time. There are many industries that for heat load and other purposes are not able to electrify, and so they would be looking further into the future for solutions like hydrogen, and that's not economic today. So there's going to take quite a while for, I think, both industry and households for that to change out. So that's going to drive the demand for some time. And so I think it continues to play an incredibly important role. I think what the events of June highlighted, and wouldn't be highlighting to many people that work in the sector, but the reality is that we knew that the firming capacity, and we all understand now that batteries' duration is hours, pumped hydro is hours, and if you have, like we saw there, rain cover and no hydro available, then gas-fired plant had to run almost baseload for 2 weeks. Now, we can't predict when that will next occur, but I think what it's highlighting to us, the tail risk of not having enough capacity over time, and to have that ability to run for many days will be something that's needed in a reliable energy system. there's no doubt that technologies like lithium-ion batteries and longer duration storage will grow. It will grow, but that won't be able to solve the entire problem. So I think we should think of it about seasonal, overnight, and intraday. And gas is going to have to continue to play a role for some time to come.
I guess on that note, Origin recently announced its intention to divest 100% of its interest in Beetaloo and also an intention to exit upstream gas. So just interested, I guess, what prompted that decision given the role you see for gas in the energy transition, and was that a difficult decision?
Yeah, they're business decisions. Ultimately, we had to make a decision about where we would allocate our capital, and obviously we've got the benefit of royalties and if it's developed a royalty and a gas contract that comes on the back of that. For us, as an integrated player across the spectrum, we're investing in both customer, power. We've got operating assets, and we reinvest as a shareholder in APLNG every year into that gas supply. So it really just came down to where we were going to prioritise the allocation of our capital. So it's ultimately a business decision and where our priorities lay. And so there are always decisions you've got to think. I think you think deeply about what's the right choices, but I think we feel pretty clear about the fact that we had our capital allocation choices became very clear to us as to where we were going to prioritise. So that in that context, it became a clearer decision for us and one that we then pursued.
And a very popular question from the audience in terms of Australia's infrastructure pipeline.
Yeah.
It's already struggling to potentially deliver it. The investment required is huge. So a question, are we able and do we have the capability to deliver it?
Yeah, I want us to hold on to the ambition of what we need to achieve, but if you hold on to that ambition, and that's 43% and 82%, that pace of change, I think it's an incredible challenge. So when people ask for higher emission reduction targets, I understand the sort of the goodwill that sits behind wanting to achieve that, but I think we've now moved from belief into execution, and so I think it will be incredibly challenging between now and 2030. And what I don't want to do is forget that we don't want to lose time, and so I think we all understand lead times, or many will understand the lead times of what it takes to bring projects to fruition. And we're sort of 8 years out, so 7.5 to 8 years out, so we need to get moving. But it is incredibly challenging, I think, to have delivered it, and there are some dependencies along the way. For any of those transmission operators out there, you'll know there's a lot of renewable projects sitting on the back of them. And yes, I think it's very challenging, but nevertheless, I wouldn't want to lose sight on that ambition right now.
And I guess what are the bringing people along on the journey, I guess what are the top 3 things do you think Origin and I guess more broadly can be done to help bring communities on that journey of the energy transition? Yeah,
I think that we need to think about firstly regional communities, because we all want the transition, but if you've got high transmission wires coming down and you've got a lot of new developments in your community, I think we should never forget that they're the communities that we need to focus them on a journey, and there are no doubt that's going to be a big shift for a lot of people in regional communities. So I'd like to think about that in a local community sense. I think there's a real job to be done, and I think we and others that participated in the development of the onshore gas industry in Queensland went through that for many years, and there's a real role and there's a real skill in my view in playing an enduring and beneficial role, not that we make up, that we hear from local communities. I think that's a key thing. The second thing is, and I think a consistent narrative about what the cost might be over time. And that's quite difficult to predict because we've still got commodity markets involved. But I think we need to connect, in my view, the infrastructure challenge for the benefit over time and play a role in helping people understand that journey so that there's not a simplified message of renewables are cheaper and my bill's expensive today. And as a result, I think we've got to draw that connection. That's not an easy thing because a lot of people work in energy and they'll be very interested, but I can tell you my mother and father, they're not looking at that. They're thinking about what's immediately impacting their lives. So we do have to continue to work on a simplified way. So that's the second. And I think ultimately the third thing is that we are going to find more people vulnerable, and I do believe that we've got to continue to strengthen and improve and do well by those that we know that could easily get left behind. That's the third thing that I think we should never forget.
You mentioned in terms of your 6 items as well, the need to have a capacity mechanism introduced. So I guess what's the value that you see in that, and what should it look like?
So without that, I firmly believe we will not have backup capacity built at the pace we need to have the reliability of a system when we're rapidly moving to a world where we've seen already that some of the ageing coal is not performing at the same reliability. And the reason I say that is that historically we were building firming capacity on the basis of a market price. And the capacity factors that we would run new, for example, of a gas-fired plant, and by the way, Origin has 3,000 megawatts, so most of our attention's focused on storage and pumped hydro. But if you were to recover that over the next 2 decades, knowing full well that that market price is going to be negative or zero for many, many hours a day, it would be very difficult to actually support an investment. Secondly, I think as a result of the last decade, if there's not an unequivocal and clear investment signal, then it wouldn't surprise you that many in the industry would wonder when the next investment might be made by a government or other participant. I think it's important that that signal is strong and simple and clear, and I have no doubt if that's done that the investment will follow. And so I think it's very important, and I think it's urgent.
And you mentioned also about the need to support vulnerable customers. So I guess what types of strategies, policies or programs would you envisage to help support vulnerable and low-income households?
Look, every retailer today will have a program in place, and our Power On program is in place. What I think is happening now is that through the work of the AER, but also each of the industry participants, we know the rising cost of living. It's engagement with customers, it's an ability to provide that support. So it's a whole range of things, from payment plans, engagement, financial assistance and support, but also I think just that we continue to rise to that challenge, and also that the standards continue to rise, I think is just an important role that we continue to play. But I shouldn't leave you with the message that there's not well-established programs in place today. They certainly are, but I do believe that we as an industry, and I think AER and others, are actually thinking about how do we get smarter across the sector to do that, and we all operate to a high standard.
Changing tact a little, energy retailing is going through such a significant change in terms of technology, focus on customers, the energy transition and the generation mix that sits behind that. How do you envisage an energy retailer will look 10 years from now? And will it be an asset light, or will it be service light? And will it be more than energy? Yeah. So starting at retailer, and I assume you were talking about gentailer as part of that, but if you're talking about well, firstly, I think you're going to find, if you're thinking about the overall energy generator retailer, we're going to find a higher proportion of distributed energy assets in the system. And the most pronounced increase for that at a distributed level over this decade will be the proliferation of electric vehicles. There will be batteries in the home, but the electric vehicles, I think, will wake up by the end of this decade and completely underestimated what's changed over time. So I do think that that's going to become a key change over time. And therefore, the balance of what's happening in the distributed versus the centralised, I think, will shift towards the distributed, but you'll need both of those systems running. When it comes to the retail component, then we can see a far more connected devices, and today we see that 120,000 devices that are automatically connected. And so I think you'll find that technology balancing supply and demand in real time will become a standard way in which we're operating, and we'll share those benefits with customers, but we'll need to do that in a simple way such that the customer understands that proposition. It's no use thinking that we're all retired engineers looking at their meters every day. They're going to understand, do they trust you, and do they know how they're going to benefit from that over time? So I actually expect that that will be significant, and I think that will change the relationship, and therefore the skills associated with us being more customer-centric as a sector over time will need to advance with that. In the context of generation supply, you're going to see, I think, a combination of wind, both offshore and onshore, as well as solar at a utility scale, coming in at a large amount. You can see that if we're to achieve that 28 gigawatts. And therefore that is driving different models today to what you might have done when you invested in a coal plant, and you can see
It's likely that retailers won't necessarily always have all of those assets on their balance sheet. They have far less when they don't need to be run, and they run, and therefore their operating costs and running regimes are much more simplified. Therefore, you're looking for the most simple mechanism in terms of the cheapest mechanism to do that. But I think you're going to still find complexity between those two worlds. But certainly I see the trend moving towards the customer and powerfully towards the customer and their participation in the market.
Hydrogen, we touched on that briefly before, but what is your role and thoughts on the role of hydrogen, and particularly commentary about Australia becoming a hydrogen superpower?
Yeah, so I think it's great that the country's actually has a vision for that, and I think we have all of the ingredients as a nation to actually make that successful. So I do like the sort of national effort behind it. As you all would know now, the cost of hydrogen is prohibitive against its use cases, although that is changing. That will change over time, but it's going to take that concerted effort over time. Some of the use cases domestically will be for diesel displacement and other specialised uses, but ultimately to bring the cost down over time, you'll need the scale of export that sits alongside it. So I think it's got a journey to go, but I do think that it is, if you're thinking about the replacement of heat load and not everything will be electrified, then ultimately hydrogen's going to play an important role. I think the timing and cost reduction pathways probably are not definitive, but you can see today that in the US under the Inflation Reduction Act, they're prepared to give $3 a kilo subsidy to go in. So you're seeing governments responding, and we should think about that in terms of Australia, not in terms of a particular thing, but we've got to think about government policies that are going to stimulate that, because we'll be competing internationally for that as well. Yeah, so I feel it's got an exciting future, but it's got a less certain pathway in the early term, but I think the ongoing coordination and effort over time should make that a big sector.
And do you think government intervention is likely to postpone the closure of Eraring?
Well, we've put our notice in, so it's unlikely they'll do retrospective, but I do think that there'll be an ongoing role between industry and governments about the phasing out of the coal. I think we need to understand that a lot of policies that have forced the renewables in it, and not now, but in the early days, is actually now meaning that those policies that inject supply in has a consequence that therefore the existing supply come out as not coordinated. In my view, overall, I'm probably not so much Eraring, but if you think about all of them that are subsequently queued up, I think it is going to be very challenging over time. So our base case is still 2025, but we'll continue to watch the market.
And how are you seeing the current state of geopolitics impacting Australia's energy transition timetable?
Geopolitics. Well, I think firstly, I'd say we're in a fortunate place to be an energy exporter. I think if you looked around the world, ourselves and the US should feel a lot better than many other countries. And that certainly, I think is demonstrable to date. But I do think that we need to recognise that we've entered a period of globalisation, and as a result, I think supply chains, I think everything that goes associated with our ability to deliver it, we should recognise we're doing that in a different world to where we might have been several years ago. So I probably think about it in a deglobalisation trend that we've got. I probably think about it more in supply chains than anything else, but in terms of stability of governments and policy and within the country, I feel pretty strongly that we're in a good place.
And a question that you touched on before about, I guess, dispelling that myth between, I guess, renewables causing increases in power prices and what can be done to help dispel that myth.
Yeah, sorry, the myth is that renewables are causing it.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think if you spend every time dispelling every myth, I understand there's a popular narrative that might go there and there's other ones that go the other way. I think that the key challenge is how do you simplify that so that people understand the transition itself, the investment that flows, and ultimately the decarbonisation that rolls from it. But I don't know if I've got any magic to how we dispel that myth other than a bit of a coordinated narrative. It hasn't helped. I don't think it's helped over time that there are so many different people with different views that are coming at the public. It's pretty hard, I think, if you're not knowledgeable to work out what's the truth. So I think we have a role, that we've all got a role responsibly to, I think, have a coordinated narrative across what this is going to be, because it's such an exciting thing to think forward to, but I think we shouldn't think that it's not without its challenge. So that's where I feel strongly about that today, more than ever.
And it'd be probably not quite the elephant in the room if I didn't ask a question potentially about the Brookfield-led consortium. So obviously an endorsement of Origin's business and strategy, but Brookfield had previously made an offer earlier this year for AGL. So what do you make of their change in direction?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't got any comments about their approach to AGL. When they did approach us, it was approached by EIG and Brookfield, and people might know the history that EIG had originally entered into a transaction for a 10% interest in APLNG that was ultimately preempted by our joint venture partner. So they came together and put a proposal to us. I don't really have any comment regarding AGL or any of those aspects. What I think has been clear is that they have, I think they've stated this very publicly, they see the transition and the opportunity to invest in renewable supply, and I think that the broader supply suite of technologies as an incredible opportunity for them over the long term. And I think in the context of, in our case, this is Brookfield, in the context of Origin announcing closures of Eraring and then going through that, having the the gas-fired peakers, I think they see that as an opportunity to enable capital to accelerate the investment into that. And that's probably what's sat behind them. I think in the case of EIG, they've got a very high conviction that LNG will play a role for longer. And they recently bid on some Tokyo Gas's assets in Australia, so I think they've got a conviction around LNG globally, and they've set up Mid-Ocean Energy to be an owner of a suite of LNG assets. So I think that's how it's come together for Origin. And I think that's an example of, in this case, private capital that's looking over an infrastructure which we describe as a challenge, but an enormous opportunity which we see as well, and the ability to go out at the pace. And we'll see. We're at a non-binding phase. They're doing due diligence now, and so there's a way to go.
And so Origin's results this year have benefited from the diversification of cash flows from the energy markets and the integrated gas business. So if the Brookfield-led consortium does proceed and that business is separated, I guess interested in your reflections of the implications of having an energy-only business and what that may mean.
Yeah, so when you think about Origin, one of the reasons why, and we haven't been asked as much recently, but we're asked why didn't you split the business? The reality is, to go through the transition, you need cash flow. And so you need cash to be able to deploy. And so whilst there's commodity linked on the LNG, we were very firmly of the view that to not have that ongoing cash flow coming from that business and being able to therefore invest and distribute to our shareholders would be too risky to go on its own. So clearly what will emerge if this transaction is successful, and it is some way to go, so we're not even at binding bid phase, is we have players that are saying they have the capital and they're therefore prepared to invest that capital. And so I think they've answered that question by virtue of the way they've put forward what they're prepared to invest in the case of Brookfield. So, yeah, so from our perspective, I think in the absence of having the APLNG business, it would make a transition much riskier for our shareholders over time. And that's the reason why we felt, and by the way, felt strongly about the role that gas would play for a period of time as an operating asset. And so that's what really was always figuring in our minds about that transition. And so hence you go back to the Beetaloo, we said, well, we've got so much opportunity that sits before us, we have to make some choices about where we were prioritising. If someone's prepared to say they want to spend 20 billion, then I'll take the 20 billion. That's great.
And a last question before we wrap up. So it's interested in your reflections, I guess, the balancing act from a community perspective of the profits that companies make when, I guess, commodity prices are high, and I guess the community expectations of those profits, and I guess balancing that piece of requirement to invest capex to generate a profit and earn a return versus the community perception of the profitability or returns generated from that.
It's a real challenge because you can see that while commodities and the transition's underway, I expect that we'll see ongoing volatility. And it was only 2 years ago we had negative prices for oil, and then swings back. But also that, in some ways, has accentuated volatility because who was going to invest in more supply with that commodity outlook in the middle of the pandemic? And so that's why I think the supply-demand balance was already very stretched before the Ukraine situation, and it's accentuated in some ways. I think they're connected. So I do feel that that's one of the challenges going forward, because that commodity link, and as you know, while it's low, that's acceptable, but if you get the percentage increase from it, no one says where did it come from, it just says what are you increasing by. And so I do think we have to hold our nerve. I accept that there needs to be ways of thinking about what might be the way you smooth that over time. But ultimately, if you want capital to flow as well, and we want the investment in new supply, people have got to have confidence that ultimately that markets will, or the revenue that underpins those is something that they can at least assess without exogenous factors. So I'm of the view that that's quite an important thing, but I'm not sure we're going to escape ourselves from volatility in commodities. I certainly can see that if you go into the future, then when more renewables are in the system, more storage in the system, you would have a dampening effect of that over time. But while ever we have that, I think we've got that challenge. And that is a real challenge because I think that's a challenge with bringing the community along. We would much prefer it wasn't going through quite the roller coaster and it would go smoothly. I think for that reason, when I think about this decade compared to last, the ability to consistently bring that supply through is so important over time, because if we don't get the old system staying in for long enough while we build the new, we're going to have some shocks on the way. I think that is one of the most important things to achieve. I think a little bit more predictability, and that makes it easier for us and consumers and everyone in the sector.
Thank you, and that was our last question. So I will welcome Jet back to the stage to formally close. Thank you.
Thank you, that's fine. Where we go next? Thanks.
Bit shorter than Frank. Thank you, Frank and Fiona, for such a thoughtful and robust discussion, and thank you all for your questions. It was great to see Pigeonhole really lighting up, so we love that. I think a couple of takeaways from me from Frank's remarks, both his speech and in conversation, a real call to us to hold on to our ambition. It's clear that it's time to move from belief to action. We must bring the community along, and we must ensure our most vulnerable are not left behind. I'd like to thank again PwC for their generous support of today's event, and thank you to all the CEDA members in the room. We can't do our job without you. It's a busy time of year, of course. At CEDA, we're not done yet. There's still plenty happening before the holidays. And we'd welcome your participation at some of our upcoming events. On Thursday, we'll host the RBA review panel in Sydney. On Tuesday, the 6th of December, our final event for the year in New South Wales, reflecting on 30 years since Paul Keating's Redfern address. If you're interested in CEDA's event programming, our research, our other activities, if you're not yet a member, now's a great time to join. Please feel free to reach out to me or the team. Again, a big thank you all, and please, before we depart, join me in a round of applause for Frank and Fiona.